All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome back to Legal Studies 160. This is the beginning of class, or lecture 7, number 7. And this week, today and on Thursday, we're going to be essentially rounding out our study of the classic public execution ritual as it operated in at least European societies and satellites of Europe like North America and Australia until the middle of, basically the early to middle part of the 19th century. Today, I'm going to try to, in a sense, work with you to try to understand as closely as we can how this system worked. You know, what was positive about it, in a sense? Why did it work for the people who did it? Obviously, a lot of energy went into running this capital punishment system, and eventually, across Europe and other societies, it came to be seen as deeply flawed and in need of fixing. But there was a long time in which it appeared to be just right, continued to have lots of supporters even after it began to decline. So today, we'll sort of try to understand what worked about the system. On Thursday, we'll sort of think hard about how it came to seem flawed and failing to its contemporaries, and the degree to which that began a debate about the morality and justness of capital punishment, which has lasted into our own time. The other thing I want to do today is build on or increase our trove of sort of social theoretical toolkits. We've spent some time with Durkheim. Today's reading comes from Michel Foucault, who's in many ways a successor to Durkheim as a great French philosopher and social thinker, very interested in punishment. And I'll also introduce to you, anticipating Thursday's reading, at least a certain kind of Marxist historiographic approach to punishment, which is very much exemplified by what's called the Warwick School, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But so we'll have sort of three. We'll have moved from one toolkit to three, although I think you'll see there's a lot of overlaps. So the first thing I want to do is sort of take you back through the execution ritual. I'm going to go back over some of the slides from last time. I've added a few new ones, and we'll move into the lecture 7 proper in a moment, but it'll be part of the same display for those of you watching at home. Okay, so we talked way back on Thursday. We began with a execution in Amsterdam in the 18th century. And the Dutch ritual, the Dutch criminal procedure and rituals were a bit different than England in some important ways, but they also shared some stuff in common. The important differences, which I just want to point out, in Holland and across most of the continent of Europe, judicial torture, as we saw with the Donkers case, in which he confessed after just being shown the tools of torture, was an integral part of the justice system. That was not true in England, where with the exception of certain distinctive courts like the Star Chamber, judicial torture was not permitted. Somebody was asking me last time, sort of what motivated this, what might explain this commitment to judicial torture. Well, one reason is that, and one way that England differed from the continent, in most continental systems, in order to be executed, to be subjected to that kind of grotesque torture on the scaffold that we saw was the key of their capital punishment ritual, you had to confess to your crime. If you did not confess, even if the evidence was overwhelming against you, they could not put you to death. They could do other things to you, right? So in a sense, that was a protection for the defendant, but it also then created this necessity to extract a confession. We'll talk a little bit more today, because I think one thing England shares, even though it never practiced this kind of judicial torture, and I think you see this in the Foucault reading, is the importance of the truth being produced by the body of the criminal. And today we take that to be a problem, right? So if we torture somebody, we don't quite trust the evidence that it produces. There's a way in which, both certainly for torture, but even more for the execution ritual itself, it was designed to produce a certain kind of truth. So we're going to focus here on the English ritual. I'll try to note where it differs in important ways from the continental procedures. It would have begun for somebody convicted of a potentially capital crime. And let me remind you that in England and Scotland in this period, there were a great many crimes that were capital crimes, including theft, including all kinds of coining and forgery, what you might think of as almost sort of white-collar crime in that respect, and all manner of felonies. But only a very small portion of these felons were sentenced to death. A good deal of power lay in the judge. Under English common law, if the crime was murder, the judge had a mandatory obligation to sentence to death. But for lots of other crimes, including manslaughter, robbery, burglary, theft, it would have been up to the judge. One of the rituals involved in capital punishment was that when in English, and this was true in Scotland as well, when a judge in this era sentenced somebody to death, they would place a black cap, as you see in this illustration, on top of their wig as they pronounced the sentence. And it could be done in it was quite a dramatic experience. At the beginning of the reading for Thursday, Peter Leinebau's chapter on the surgeons, the riots at Tyburn with the surgeons, begins with precisely a lengthy quote from one of these execution speeches. And they often ended with, "And you shall be taken to the scaffold and hung by your neck until you are dead, dead, dead." They would repeat it sometimes several times to make the point. So this would have been a very dramatic beginning. In some ways, the publicness of the punishment is already beginning at this moment. The next station for the condemned person would have been the jail. We talked about last time. Typically, you would have spent 2 to 3 months in jail awaiting the execution of your sentence, as we'll talk about in a little bit. During this time, actually, there'd be an intense effort by your family, typically, to try to seek a pardon, because the overwhelming majority of people sentenced to death in just the ritual I showed you were nonetheless spared by exercise of the royal prerogative of pardon. So while the condemned person might be quite inactive, in effect, in the jail, their family, if they had family, would be seeking a pardon. For those for whom a pardon was not forthcoming, or for whom the family simply ran out of resources or influence to try to obtain a pardon, they would be a great effort, and we'll talk about this a bit more on Thursday, to bring the family together. And this time was important for that point of view. After all, if we're talking about London, which is where a great many of these executions took place, the majority of people executed in London weren't from London. They were poor immigrants from Ireland or from other parts of England or Scotland, and so often they would not have seen their family for months or perhaps even years. And so this event at Tyburn, one of its functions would have been to operate as something of a family reunion. And so you'd be gathering the family together during this time in order to participate in this. As the execution date neared, and as I said, it was typically about 2 months, depending on if you were in London, it would be 2 months or less. If you were in a more remote jurisdiction, it might be longer before a court session would be held. Just before, say the Sunday before your execuation, there was the ritual of the execution sermon. And this was an English tradition, also practiced in colonial North America. Typically, these chapels, as this one here, sorry, not a large enough file to stretch out this far, sorry. When you download these slides, you'll be able to look, and I will start posting them. You'll be able to look at these in a bit more, it'll be a little bit better quality image on your computer screen than it is on there. But this was actually at the Newgate Jail. There's this chapel room, and basically all of the, not just the condemned persons, but also other people subject to various kinds of non-lethal scaffold punishment would be, at the next such penal event, would be brought together into the church. The audience, which you can see is sitting up here in the galleries, those were paid seats. They were sort of good citizens who paid, usually elite citizens who would pay to see us. And you might, again, think that this is rather kind of curious, that they wanted to voyeuristic, that they were just wanted to see these people who were going to be executed shortly. Part of it was religious. This was the last opportunity in some ways to save the souls of those who would be killed here. We have to take seriously the fact that many of the people in this society would have been deeply religious, would have completely believed that this was part of a justice process that would go on in heaven or in judgment in heaven and perhaps hell afterwards. So there was a great religious interest in these events. We talked about the procession last time. Again, the English customs here are a little bit different. In France and in other continental countries, this would have been a bit more controlled by this, sort of the execution officials. Typically, what was known in France as the amende honorable, you would make a certain number of ritual gestures on your way to your execution. You might be brought to a church door where you would make seek some blessings from clerical officials. You might be taken to the scene of the crime, where certain other speeches would be given and the event noted, etc. In London, it seems to have been aimed very specifically at exposing the person soon to be executed to the public. This was part of the publicness of the public execution. Not just that the scene of the execution itself was a public event, and a very festive and chaotic one at that, but even the way to the execution, you would have been carried through some of the densest populated neighborhoods in London, full of, and these aren't necessarily the highest class neighborhoods in London, they are now, but they weren't at the time. There would have been lots of poor people in these neighborhoods. Many of the people in the cart would have seen their friends and neighbors on the way. And so this would, again, a moment where there's a potential for solidarity between the offender who's on his way to being executed and the crowd, but also the potential for public wrath at the criminal, depending on what their reputation was and how they stood. So then you were taken to the execution site itself at Tyburn. And here's the amazing illustration we have of this, thanks to the great artist William Hogarth. This represents one of the whole series of illustrations that Hogarth did surrounding what a character called the idle apprentice. It basically showed the life course of a person who sort of begins by not following his parents' instructions and goofing off in church, and he ends up, hung. So it's a morality tale in very, very real. But also, I think we know from other contemporary sources, we can say that this is a strikingly accurate picture of what it looked like at Tyburn. And again, I wish I had the better. If I was an art historian or something, I'd be able to take you into the details here. Fortunately, there are a few that have been done by others. You can find up on the web. So one of the characters that's been identified and written about by historians is this guy over here. He's quite clearly selling stuff, and he was known apparently as the gingerbread man. And from other historical sources, we know that he also sold his gingerbread at various kinds of events around London, festivals, their version of sporting events, which would have been things like bear baiting, where they would have a bear fighting with dogs in a kind of amphitheater. So he was a regular seller of these delectables at festival events all over London. But just underscores that that's how these execution days were. They were kind of a festival day. You would take your kids out. You would obviously buy them lunch while you were out there. People selling beverages as well. Here's a close-up of the, again, I'm sorry for the effect of blowing these slides up too much, but the condemned man on the cart, he's got the chaplain with him. He's actually reading from the prayer book, and he's being exhorted by the chaplain. Key to all of the executions, both in England and on the continent, is the role of clergy. Clergy play a very significant role. Indeed, the character here that you can just make out peering through his carriage window is the person that was known as the Ordinary of Newgate. And the Ordinary was essentially the head chaplain. He has one of his assistants in the cart actually preaching to the condemned. The Ordinary was a higher official. He would sort of preside, along with the sheriff, over the whole thing. In one of the interesting sort of features of the economy of these events, one of the benefits of being the Ordinary of Newgate Jail, the chief chaplain, is essentially you had the right to publish the life story of the offender, those broadsheets that we talked about last time, that depicted the life of the offender and often fictitiously presented their death speech, etc. These were actually the commercial property of the Ordinary. They essentially owned the movie rights, as it were, the book rights to these what would have been a popular interest. There's the dying speech itself, which again, critical part of the tradition. We know that often the ones that we have in the broadsheets were bogus because they were published before the speeches. But it's a very interesting phenomena. Again, it goes to the publicness of these executions, and it has an echo today, right? One of the last things that connects these scenes to the kind of scenes of execution that we have today in the United States in the era of lethal injection is the last words of the condemned, which remain something that is, I think, asked in every state. And there's some haunting compilations you can find on the web of things that people have said at those speeches. But these were obviously much bigger deal. You would have been surrounded by a crowd full of your friends and neighbors and relatives, as well as in the much more austere setting you're in today, where some of your family will be there, and the victim's family, but nobody will be allowed to say anything. It'll be dead quiet, etc. You'll be cut off from them. Here, there's a lively scene, and your speech is your last, words in this world, and your last words to your loved ones. Certainly, this was an opportunity from the system's point of view to vindicate itself. If you gave a truly repentant speech about how terrible your life of crime was, and how you ended up on the gallows, and what a shame it was, and how parents ought to lead their kids in a better way, etc., that lent to the entire occasion, as you can imagine, a kind of sanctity and appropriateness that it would have lacked without. On the other hand, if the person used those last moments without any threat hanging over them to just let loose their outrage at their judges and at the system that had brought them to this fate, and some of them did, they could be expected to give some of the most denigrating and radical comments on the state of society that would have been heard. So these were very fraught occasions in that sense. They were intended to produce powerful effects precisely through their publicness, and yet that publicness opened up the possibility of failure or even reversal. And of course, the culmination would have been the actual hanging itself. In England and Scotland, that was pretty much the ubiquitous penalty, with some exceptions. Women, sometimes, especially higher status women, might be gibbeted, which would essentially mean strangulated in a sitting position, somewhat more private kind of a death than strangulation on the noose, which is essentially public strangulation. On the continent, execution typically involves some mechanism of separating the head from the body, either an axe, a guillotine, a sword, or the breaking on the cross or wheel that we saw was the main execution feature in Amsterdam. Now, what all of these share, and we can talk about the differences among them, but all of them share is clearly, and I want to move on to this amazing portrait that is featured on the cover of Gatrell's book, The Hanging Tree. But there's a detail from an 1820 painting called Public Hanging by an artist named Theodore Gericault. Unfortunately, this one comes out pretty well here. And I think it's so you're now standing as close, or you're figuratively as close to these condemned people as the closest people in the audience at Tyburn would have been. It would have just been a row of soldiers or something between you and the gallows, but you would have been able, had you been that close to see their features just like this. And while hanging certainly was viewed by the English as a bit more civilized than a beheading, it's very clear that this was intended neither to be painless nor to be a quiet and decorous death, but even if it didn't involve gushing blood that you would have had from a beheading, it was intended nonetheless to display in a very real and palpable sense the physicality of death. Again, hanging is death not by a quick break of the neck, as it would become at the end of the 19th century with the so-called long drop, but is instead a form of strangulation. And when you're strangled in that kind of a setting where you're hanging by your neck, you're typically going to be having spasms. You're going to have all kinds of bloating of the face, bugging out of the eyes, etc. And notice they had these white claws that were hung over their face, which was intended perhaps to give them a little bit of a separation, a little bit of privacy from the crowd. But it's also clear that because they were white and not black, that they were intended in a way to display very clearly what was happening, whether the person was coughing or breathing, spitting up blood, etc. Would have been much more visible than it would have in the case of a black cap pulled over the head. So this was a very carefully choreographed ritual. A couple other things to notice here. One is the clothes of the people. What do you notice about the clothes on the scaffold here? Are they wearing orange jumpsuits? They're dressed up in their finest. For your funeral or your wedding. And it was often, again, keep in mind, these are deeply religious people, some of whom, the fact that you're on that scaffold doesn't mean that you don't view yourself as a Christian in good standing with your maker. And your anticipation, especially if you thought you were being hung for an unjust execution, like for a small amount of thievery required by your children's hunger, etc., you would have expected that you were going to meet your maker quite literally. And so people went to their deaths in their wedding suits. The English viewed this as a sort of piece of the pride in the rights of the individual. That is, that instead of being displayed to look at the way the state wants you to look, you get to look the way you want to look. And people would often go into extraordinary debt to look good. As one character quoted by Peter Linebaugh puts it, I want to die game. I want to look, good, look like I'm still on top of my world, even as I'm leaving it. And this led people to make great sacrifices. As we'll see on Thursday, one of the ways that a condemned person could make money would be by agreeing to have their body given over to the surgeons for anatomy. Often that was happened whether you liked it or not as part of your sentence. Nonetheless, if you wanted to make your own side deal, it was a way you could get some money, and people did. They would spend that money typically on clothes, so they would look very good. By the way, part of the economy of the execution ritual, we said that the ordinary of Newgate owned the rights to sell your story. The sheriff, who essentially presided over the execution, owned your clothes. That was part of his compensation. He got your clothes, right? And so with hanging, typically the pants certainly would have been soiled, perhaps cleanable, but they would have been otherwise brand new clothes. The jackets, the shirts, etc., would have fetched quite a bit of money or become part of the sheriff's own wardrobe. So again, part of the kind of political economy, if you will, of these scenes. Again, you have clergy that are, you have essentially the two kinds of professionals who are on the scaffold with the condemned, the sheriff's deputies, who would have been there fitting the ropes around the neck, etc., essentially employees of the sheriff, and then the clerical workers, the chaplains, who would again be exhorting the condemned and consoling them, in some ways helping them prepare to die. Now, as we'll see next time, we'll talk a bit more about this. For some of the condemned, the execution ritual was not the end of their torments planned for them. They were to be dissected in the medical college by the anatomists, again, a kind of a public display, although this time in front of paying medical students rather than the general public. Finally, and we'll spend a lot of time on this next time, this often led to a kind of riotous behavior. Linebaugh describes a scene in Edinburgh, and this is one of the execution sites in Edinburgh. Anyone ever visited this tavern with the tactful name, the Last Drop Inn? It sits fairly close to one of the execution sites in Edinburgh, in the Grass Market. So if you visit the Grass Market next time you're in Edinburgh, you can have a pint at the Last Drop. But you can imagine, as it happened in that case, a young man was being hung, and people thought it was pretty unjust, and as some errors were committed by the executioner, the crowd got so angry that they tore down the gallows and tried to rescue the condemned. Unfortunately for him, he was resecured by soldiers and ultimately rehung. But this kind of a football match atmosphere under the gallows was one of the things that came to trouble people all over Europe about executions. On the one hand, that riotous behavior could sometimes be directed against the criminals and therefore enhance, I suppose, the message of the execution from a point of view of royal power or even deterrence. But often, or at least some of the time, these riots could turn around and become an attack on authority. So again, taking in now for a moment all the parts of this quite elaborate ceremony, which begins well before the execution with scenes of judicial torture or scenes like the black cap magistrate in the courtroom, and it ends after the execution, sometimes with riots under the scaffold or with the dissection of the victim. But I want to kind of, keeping those all in mind for a moment, I want to sort of begin to pivot to the question of what does this ceremony do? How does it work? And I want to begin with kind of our classic, if you will, individual motivations for punishment that we have seen have been much studied and debated by disciplines like economics, philosophy, and psychology. It's a little bit anachronistic, of course, to apply these concepts to the Tyburn scene. If you can imagine yourself, working through the crowd with a clipboard, sort of interviewing the audience at a Tyburn execution and asking them, excuse me, sir, do you favor capital punishment? If you do, would you tell me which of the following justifications comes closest to your own views on why capital punishment is appropriate? And then you'd read them a cue for deterrence and retribution, incapacitation, rehabilitation. And again, that would be very anachronistic because for this era, those justifications for punishment are just in the future, right? In the 18th century, at a scene like Tyburn, execution doesn't need justifying. It's just how it's done. It's after this scene becomes problematic that philosophers and proto-social scientists debating the meaning of punishment and how it should be reformed begin to define these values as ones that are crucial. Nonetheless, notwithstanding that anachronistic quality, we have to imagine that this elaborate ritual did some work to address what we think of as these enduring and long-term purposes of punishment. What do you see there of any of these? Deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, rehabilitation? How do you think this ceremony worked, if at all, to achieve those ends? And what, anticipating Thursday's discussion, what kinds of problems in terms of these classic purposes of punishment do you see in the execution ceremony as we've studied it thus far? Deterrence? Would this deter? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to say deterrence, because the point of it being so public was not for the person receiving the punishment, but for those who witnessed it. So, I feel like you mean.
Do you think this would have been a very effective form of deterrence?
No.
Why not?
But I think only because I can look at it retrospectively and I know it did. The riots happened and then it became obsolete. So.
But that doesn't tell us whether it worked, right? I mean, there's a paradox here, right? I mean, surely, the way to put it is this, right? The fact that murders occur can be taken by some as evidence that executions or whatever the primary punishment for murder is doesn't work to deter, or what we could assume is that there's a large number of murders that have been prevented because people looked at this scene and were shocked or horrified, or it helped to somehow connect in their mind the kind of crimes. I mean, think about the Idle Apprentice itself, the Hogarth, the full narrative.